Jack Thompson had always found solace in the heart of the Blackwood Forest. After retiring from a long and often grueling career as sheriff, the quiet embrace of the towering trees and whispering leaves had become his sanctuary. Every weekend, he would lace up his hiking boots, grab his thermos of coffee, courtesy of his ever-supportive wife, Linda, and set off on his familiar trails. But on this crisp October afternoon, as golden leaves carpeted the forest floor and the air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, something felt different. Jack had wandered a bit farther than usual, following an unmarked path that veered off from the main trail. The forest was still, save for the occasional rustling of squirrels in the underbrush and the distant call of a hawk. It was the kind of peace Jack had grown to appreciate, a stark contrast to the chaos he had faced in his decades of service. Then, out of nowhere, the tranquility shattered. A scream, high-pitched, guttural, and laced with agony, echoed through the trees. Jack froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an ordinary animal sound either. He had heard many distress calls in his time, coyotes yelping in the night, deer crying out when caught in a hunter's snare, but this was different. This was pure suffering. Instinct took over. Years of training and experience had conditioned Jack to respond to distress, to move toward danger rather than away from it. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and pressed forward, weaving through the dense underbrush. Another scream, closer this time. Jack quickened his pace, stepping over fallen logs and ducking beneath low-hanging branches. The sound of frantic thrashing accompanied the cries, and he knew whatever was making the noise was fighting for its life. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice loud in the eerie silence between the desperate cries. No response came, only another agonized wail. He reached a small clearing where the afternoon light barely pierced the thick canopy overhead. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just ferns, scattered rocks, and the familiar autumnal hues of the forest floor. But then, near the base of an ancient oak, something shifted. Jack's breath caught in his throat. A large, dirt-covered sack lay among the leaves, its surface writhing with frantic movement. The cries were coming from inside. His stomach churned. He had seen cruelty in many forms, but this was something particularly vile. Someone had tied up a living creature and left it to die. Dropping to one knee, Jack pulled out his pocket knife, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. The sack was tightly bound with baling wire, its edges frayed and caked with mud. The animal inside let out another desperate cry, thrashing harder as Jack worked to free it. "Easy there," he murmured, though he knew his words were meaningless to whatever was trapped inside. "I'm going to get you out." As he cut through the final wire and carefully peeled back the sack, he found himself face to face with a pair of wide, golden eyes, wild, terrified, and burning with an animalistic fury. A bobcat. The creature was emaciated, its once beautiful tawny coat matted with dirt and dry blood. Another wire had been cruelly wrapped around its legs, binding them tightly to its frail body. The bobcat let out a weak, rattling growl, baring its sharp teeth in a final display of defiance. Jack exhaled, his mind racing. He had to act fast. The animal was barely clinging to life. If he hesitated, it would die right here in this forsaken part of the forest. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had left this animal to suffer. And as Jack worked to free the bobcat from its cruel restraints, one thought burned in his mind: who could do something like this? Jack knelt beside the frail bobcat, his pulse pounding as he took in its pitiful state. The creature's body was unnaturally thin, its ribs stark against its matted fur. Its breathing was labored, and its golden eyes, though filled with an instinctual fire, flickered with exhaustion. Jack had encountered many distressing sights in his years as sheriff, but something about this moment, about the pure helplessness of this wild creature, stirred something deep inside him. He knew he had to act quickly. Slipping his knife back into his pocket, he carefully unwrapped the wire from the bobcat's legs, wincing as he saw the deep, raw indentations left behind. The animal shuddered at his touch but was too weak to resist. Jack hesitated for only a second before shedding his jacket and gently wrapping the bobcat inside. It barely weighed anything in his arms. A full-grown bobcat should have been nearly twice as heavy. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Jack murmured as he cradled the animal close to his chest. The bobcat let out a weak, pitiful sound, not a growl, not a snarl, but something softer, something almost pleading. Jack knew the nearest ranger station was miles away. There was no time to wait for help. His only option was Maplewood Animal Hospital, a small veterinary clinic in the town of Millfield, 3 miles down the mountain. He had passed it on his way to the trailhead countless times, but had never had a reason to stop. Now, he could only hope someone was still there. Jack started down the rough forest trail, moving as fast as he dared. The terrain was uneven, with gnarled roots and loose stones threatening to trip him, but he tightened his grip on the bobcat and pressed forward. The cool autumn air did nothing to stop the sweat gathering on his forehead. His arms ached from the effort of carrying the animal, but he refused to slow down. Every few steps, he glanced down at the bobcat, worried by how still it had become. Its breathing was shallow, its body frighteningly limp. "Stay with me," Jack urged. "Just a little longer." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he kept pushing forward, forcing himself into a steady jog despite the weight in his arms. By the time he finally stumbled out of the forest and onto the paved road leading into Millfield, his muscles screamed in protest. The town was quiet, the streets mostly empty, but the lights in the distance signaled his destination, Maplewood Animal Hospital. Jack nearly collapsed against the clinic's glass door, pounding on it with his free hand. "Hello? Emergency," he shouted. "Is anyone there?" For a terrifying moment, there was nothing, only the stillness of the town, the flickering of a street lamp. Then, to his immense relief, a light flicked on in the back of the clinic. Moments later, a woman appeared in the doorway, wearing scrubs and an expression of confusion. Her name tag read Jesse Parker, a vet technician. She started to speak, likely to tell him the clinic was closed, but her words caught in her throat when she saw what he was carrying. "Oh my God," Jesse gasped. "What is that?" "A bobcat," Jack panted. "Found it in the woods, trapped, bound in wire, it's dying. Please, I need help." Jesse didn't hesitate. She quickly unlocked the door and waved him inside. "Dr. Carter is still here, come on, bring it back," she instructed, leading him through a hallway lined with examination rooms. Jack followed without question, stepping into a sterile treatment room where a woman in her late 40s stood reviewing paperwork. Dr. Emily Carter turned at the sound of their entrance, her brow furrowing at the sight of the battered creature in Jack's arms. "What happened?" she asked, immediately moving toward them. Jack laid the bobcat carefully onto the examination table. "Someone tied it up in a sack and left it to die. It's dehydrated, malnourished, I don't know how long it's been in there." Dr. Carter pressed 2 fingers to the bobcat's side, her face set in grim concentration. "Heart rate is weak," she murmured. "Jesse, get the 4 set up. We need fluids and antibiotics, now." Jesse rushed to comply while Dr. Carter continued her assessment. She gently pried open the bobcat's mouth, frowning at the pale gums. "Severe dehydration," she confirmed. "And these wounds," she gestured to the deep indentations left by the wire. This was deliberate. Jack clenched his fists. "I figured as much." "Who did this?" Dr. Carter asked. "I don't know. But I intend to find out." For the next hour, Jack stood silently by as Dr. Carter and Jesse worked tirelessly to stabilize the bobcat. They inserted in 4, delivering fluids and much-needed nutrients into its fragile body. They cleaned its wounds, carefully treating the deep cuts with antibiotics. An oxygen mask was placed over its muzzle to assist its labored breathing. Jack watched, tension coiling in his chest. The bobcat, this wild, resilient creature, had already endured so much. Would it survive the night? Finally, Dr. Carter stepped back, exhaling. "We've done all we can for now. It's up to her to fight." Jack's eyes flickered to the bobcat. It lay motionless on the table, its breathing now steadier but still fragile. Her, he echoed. Dr. Carter nodded. Yes, it's a female. Likely no older than 2 years. She glanced at him curiously. You care about this animal? Jack hesitated before nodding. I found her. I couldn't just leave her. Dr. Carter's expression softened. Well, let's hope she pulls through. She deserves a chance. Jesse re-entered the room, clipboard in hand. We need a name for her records. Jack looked down at the bobcat, at her golden eyes, her determined but weakened spirit. Shadow, he said after a moment. She fought to stay alive, even in the dark. Jesse smiled. Shadow it is. As the night stretched on, Jack sat in the waiting room, unwilling to leave. He knew one thing for certain: no matter what happened next, he wasn't walking away from this fight. Shadow had endured cruelty beyond comprehension, and now it was time for someone to stand up for her. And Jack was ready. The days following Shadow's rescue blurred together in a cycle of cautious hope and growing attachment. Jack found himself returning to Maplewood Animal Hospital every morning, unable to shake the deep sense of responsibility he felt toward the fragile creature he had pulled from the brink of death. At first, Dr. Carter was skeptical of his continued presence. You don't have to keep coming back, she told him one afternoon as she checked Shadow's foreline. She's stable now. We've got things handled. I know, Jack admitted, watching the bobcat breathe steadily beneath the warm glow of a heat lamp. But I need to see this through. Dr. Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but if you're going to be here, you might as well be useful. And so, Jack became an unofficial assistant in Shadow's recovery. Under Dr. Carter's guidance, he learned how to properly prepare her meals, finely chopped raw meat mixed with nutrient supplements, and how to clean her enclosure without startling her. He observed from a distance as Jesse administered treatments, noting how Shadow tensed every time a human hand came near. But little by little, that fear began to wane. At first, Shadow would press herself into the corner of her enclosure whenever Jack entered, her golden eyes tracking his every move. But over time, something changed. She no longer flinched when he approached, and some days, she would even lift her head in silent acknowledgement before settling back down. Then, on the 9th day of her stay, something remarkable happened. Jack had just set a small dish of food inside her enclosure when, instead of waiting for him to leave like she usually did, Shadow crept forward while he was still there. She sniffed the air cautiously, her ears twitching. Then, with deliberate slowness, she took a piece of meat from the long tongs he held. Jack held his breath as her rough tongue brushed against the metal. Dr. Carter, who had been watching from the doorway, raised an eyebrow. That's a good sign. Jack exhaled, a small smile tugging at his lips. She's trusting me. Dr. Carter crossed her arms. Maybe. Or maybe she's just hungry enough to take the risk. But Jack knew it was more than that. Shadow was beginning to recognize him, not just as another human, but as the human who had saved her. Shadow's progress continued over the next few weeks. She regained weight steadily, her coat became sleek again, and her movements grew stronger. She no longer cowered when Jack entered her enclosure. Some days, she even approached the fence, watching him with a curious gaze rather than the fear that had once dominated her expression. She's doing better than I expected, Dr. Carter admitted one afternoon. Her physical wounds have healed well. Jack frowned, sensing a but in her tone. What's the problem? Dr. Carter sighed. It's her behavior. She's been in human care for too long. She's different now. Jack looked over at Shadow, who was curled up on a soft blanket near the back of the enclosure. She's still a bobcat. Yes, but she's lost some of her natural instincts, Dr. Carter explained. She doesn't see humans as a threat anymore. That's dangerous for an animal like her. If she were released back into the wild now, she might approach people looking for food instead of hunting. She wouldn't know how to properly defend herself. It could get her killed. Jack's stomach tightened. He had hoped, assumed, really, that once Shadow was healthy again, she would be set free. that she would return to the forest, strong and independent, as if none of this had ever happened. But that wasn't possible. "She can't go back," he murmured. Dr. Carter shook her head. "Not safely." Jack rubbed a hand down his face. "So what happens now?" Dr. Carter sighed. "Normally, animals like her are sent to a wildlife sanctuary, but most of them are overcrowded. And let's be honest, bobcats aren't exactly the star attraction in places like that. If we don't find a suitable place for her," she hesitated, then said, "euthanasia is an option." Jack felt like he had been punched in the gut. "No," he said immediately. "That's not happening." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "Then we need to find another solution." Jack looked back at Shadow, who had her head lifted slightly, watching him with those piercing golden eyes. He had saved her once. He wasn't about to let her down now. Jack couldn't sleep that night. Dr. Carter's words replayed in his mind, "If we don't find a suitable place for her, euthanasia is an option." He stared at the ceiling in frustration. Shadow had fought so hard to survive. After everything she had endured, after the trust she had placed in him, how could he let that be her fate? Beside him, Linda stirred. "You're thinking about the bobcat, aren't you?" she murmured. Jack sighed. "I can't let them put her down, Linda. She deserves better than that." Linda turned onto her side, studying her husband's face in the dim light. "What are you planning to do?" Jack hesitated. The idea had been forming in his mind all day, but saying it out loud made it real. "What if we take her?" Linda blinked. "Take her? You mean, bring a wild bobcat into our home?" "Not inside the house," Jack clarified. "But we have the old workshop behind the garage. We could convert it into a proper enclosure, make it safe, give her space to move around. I've been looking into it. With the right permits, it's possible to keep a rescued bobcat legally." Linda sat up slightly, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Jack, this isn't like taking in a stray dog. She's a wild animal." "I know," he admitted. "But she can't go back to the wild. And if the sanctuaries won't take her, what other choice do we have?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. Jack could tell she was weighing the idea carefully, just as she had always done with his more impulsive decisions. Then, finally, she let out a soft chuckle. "You always did have a habit of bringing home the ones that needed saving." Jack smiled. "So, you're not against it?" Linda sighed but gave him a small, knowing smile. "Let me meet her first. If I'm going to agree to turning our backyard into a bobcat sanctuary, I want to see what all the fuss is about." The next morning, Jack brought Linda to Maplewood Animal Hospital. Dr. Carter was initially skeptical. "You want to take her in?" she asked, arms crossed. "You do realize what you're signing up for?" "We do," Linda said firmly before Jack could answer. Dr. Carter studied them both, then sighed. "All right. Let's see how she reacts to you." They approached Shadow's enclosure together. The bobcat, now stronger and more alert, lifted her head as they neared. Jack could feel Linda tense beside him, but Shadow didn't hiss or shrink away. Instead, she simply watched them, ears twitching forward in curiosity. "She recognizes you," Linda murmured. "She does," Jack said, a quiet sense of pride in his voice. Linda stepped a little closer, observing the bobcat's sleek coat, the healed scars, the intelligence in her golden eyes. Finally, she turned back to Dr. Carter. "What would we need to do to make this happen?" Dr. Carter was visibly surprised but quickly recovered. "Well, for starters, you'll need to apply for a special wildlife rehabilitation permit. You'll also need to build a proper enclosure, one with secure fencing, places for her to climb, enrichment activities, and enough space to keep her stimulated. Diet is another major factor. Bobcats require specific nutrition, fresh meat, not just any store-bought pet food." Jack nodded. "We're ready to do whatever it takes." Dr. Carter studied him for a long moment, then finally smiled. "All right. Let's make it happen." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and construction. Jack enlisted the help of his son, Michael, along with a few old friends from his sheriff's department days. Together, they transformed the dusty old workshop into a fully equipped bobcat enclosure. They installed sturdy fencing that extended beneath the ground to prevent digging and curved at the top to stop climbing. Inside, they built platforms at various heights, added large hollow logs for hiding spots, and even included a small pool for Shadow to drink from and play in. "It's like a bobcat palace," Michael joked one afternoon as they finished installing the last safety lock on the enclosure's main gate. "Only the best for our girl," Jack replied, wiping sweat from his brow. Meanwhile, Linda handled the permit application process, working closely with state wildlife officials to ensure everything was legal. Thanks to a letter of recommendation from Dr. Carter and the wildlife rehabilitator who had assessed Shadow, their application was approved faster than expected. By Christmas, everything was in place. The enclosure was ready, the paperwork had been finalized, and now, all that was left was to bring Shadow home. On the day of the transfer, a light dusting of snow covered the ground. Dr. Carter personally oversaw Shadow's sedation for the journey, ensuring the move would be as stress-free as possible. "She'll be a little groggy when she wakes up," she warned as Jack and Michael carefully carried the large transport crate into the enclosure. "Give her time to adjust before interacting too much." Jack nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation. They placed the crate in the center of the enclosure and gently opened the door. Then, stepping back behind a safety barrier, they waited. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, Shadow stirred. She blinked slowly, her body still sluggish from sedation. With a careful, deliberate movement, she stepped out of the crate, sniffing the air. Jack held his breath as she took her first steps in her new home. She moved cautiously at first, ears flicking at every sound. But as the minutes passed, her posture relaxed. She padded over to one of the platforms, hopped onto it with ease, and stretched, a clear sign of comfort. "She likes it," Linda said softly. Jack exhaled, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. "She's home." Dr. Carter smiled. "You two just became one of the few private individuals in the state to legally care for a bobcat. Not what you expected when you went hiking that day, huh?" Jack chuckled. "Not at all." That evening, as he and Linda sat on their back porch, watching the gentle snowfall settle over their property, Jack felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Shadow had been a victim of cruelty, left to die in the forest. But now, she had a second chance at life, a safe, secure place where she would be cared for and respected. Jack reached over and squeezed Linda's hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this." Linda smiled. "I saw the way she looked at you, Jack. She trusts you. And honestly, I think you needed this just as much as she did." Jack looked toward the enclosure, where Shadow lay curled up on her perch, watching them through the fence. She had survived the worst of humanity. Now, she had found the best of it. And in the process, Jack had found a new purpose in life, one he never could have expected. In the days following Shadow's arrival, Jack and Linda watched her closely, ensuring she adapted well to her new surroundings. At first, the bobcat remained cautious, spending most of her time in the higher perches of the enclosure, where she could observe everything without being seen too much herself. She explored only in short bursts, retreating whenever a sound or movement startled her. Jack understood her hesitancy. Shadow had spent weeks recovering in a sterile clinic, surrounded by humans. Now, she had an entirely new space, filled with unfamiliar scents and open air. She needed time to adjust, and Jack was willing to give her all the time she needed. Each day, he followed a routine, feeding her fresh meat, cleaning her enclosure, and ensuring she had plenty of mental stimulation. He introduced new enrichment activities, logs to scratch, hanging ropes, even a large ball she could bat around. Bit by bit, Shadow began to settle in. One morning, Jack found her lounging in the outdoor section of her enclosure, basking in the early sunlight. She wasn't hiding anymore. "She's comfortable," Linda observed, standing beside him. Jack smiled. "Yeah. she's starting to understand that this is home now. Caring for Shadow became more than just a responsibility, it became Jack's passion. He spent hours reading about bobcat behavior, consulting with wildlife experts, and even keeping in touch with Dr. Carter to ensure Shadow received the best possible care. Linda noticed the change in him. "You've got that look in your eye," she teased one evening as they sat on the porch. "What look?" Jack asked. "The one you had when you first became sheriff. The one that says you found a purpose." Jack chuckled. "Maybe I have." Word of Shadow's rescue spread throughout Millfield and neighboring communities. People were fascinated by the retired sheriff who had taken in a wild bobcat, and soon, teachers and parents began reaching out, asking if Jack could talk to children about wildlife conservation. At first, he was hesitant. "I was never much of a teacher," he told Linda. "But you're a storyteller," she reminded him. "And you have a story worth telling." So, Jack began giving small talks at local schools, sharing Shadow's journey, from the cruelty she endured to the second chance she had been given. He emphasized the importance of respecting wildlife and protecting natural habitats. Shadow became a symbol of resilience, not just for animals, but for people too. Months passed, and Shadow flourished. She no longer feared Jack's presence. Though still very much a wild animal, she showed small signs of trust, slow blinks, relaxed postures, even playful moments in her enclosure. Jack, too, had changed. He had started this journey simply trying to save a life. But in doing so, he had found something new to live for. Shadow wasn't just a bobcat. She was a reminder that, sometimes, the most unexpected paths lead to the greatest purposes. Jack had long wondered who was responsible for Shadow's suffering. He had seen many forms of cruelty in his time as sheriff, but what had been done to the young bobcat had haunted him. Someone had deliberately left her to die, bound and helpless in the middle of the wilderness. And until now, he had no answers. That changed one quiet afternoon when a Millfield Sheriff's Department vehicle pulled into his driveway. Jack recognized Deputy Ryan Collins, a young officer who had joined the force after Jack's retirement. Jack met him halfway, sensing the visit wasn't just a social call. "Afternoon, Collins," Jack greeted. "What's going on?" The deputy sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We got them, Jack." Jack's brows furrowed. "Got who?" Collins looked toward Shadow's enclosure, where the bobcat was stretched out on a wooden perch, lazily watching them through the fence. "The guys who did this to her," Collins said. "Robert and Kyle Morgan." Jack's stomach tightened at the names. He knew the Morgans by reputation, a father and son pair of longtime poachers who had always managed to stay just outside the reach of the law. They had been caught in minor violations before, trespassing, illegal hunting out of season, but they had never been tied to anything as cruel as this. "What happened?" Jack asked, crossing his arms. Collins exhaled. "Game wardens caught them last week, running illegal traps in the northern part of the county. During questioning, the son, Kyle, let something slip about a bobcat they trapped last fall." Jack's jaw tightened. "What did he say?" "They had her in a leg trap, illegal for bobcats, but she was still alive when they went to check it. She fought back, scratched the father up pretty bad. Rather than shoot her on the spot, they panicked. Stuffed her in a sack, tied it up with wire, and left her there while they went to patch up their wounds. When they came back, the bag was gone." Jack felt a rush of anger so strong it made his hands tremble. Shadow had been trapped, terrified, and left for dead, not out of necessity, but because of cowardice. "They admitted all that?" Jack asked, voice tight. "Kyle did. He was trying to cut a deal, but it's not going to do him much good. We've got evidence, and with their history of illegal poaching, the prosecutor is going after them hard." Jack nodded, his mind already made up. "You need me to testify, don't you?" Collins handed him a folder. "If you're willing. Your testimony, how you found her, the condition she was in, it'll strengthen the case." Jack didn't hesitate. "I'll do it. I want them held accountable." After Collins left, Jack walked over to Shadow's enclosure. The bobcat lifted her head as he approached, her golden eyes locking onto his. "We found them," Jack said softly. "They won't hurt anyone else." Shadow simply blinked at him, slow and deliberate. A sign of trust. For the first time in months, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice was finally being served. With justice served and the past behind them, Shadow finally had the peace she deserved. She had come a long way from the frightened, emaciated creature Jack had pulled from the forest. Now, she thrived in her custom-built enclosure, moving with the quiet grace of a predator who had reclaimed her strength. Jack and Linda watched her grow, not just in health but in spirit. She was still wild, still untamed, but there was an understanding between them, a bond built on trust. "She's happy here," Linda said one evening as they sat on their back porch, watching the bobcat lounge on her high perch, her golden eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. Jack nodded. "And so am I." The decision to take in Shadow had been unexpected, but neither Jack nor Linda regretted it. She had needed saving, but in many ways, so had Jack. Caring for her had given him a new purpose, a reason to keep learning, growing, and sharing her story with others. Through Shadow, Jack had discovered something deeper, the power of resilience, the importance of second chances, and the quiet beauty of earning the trust of a creature that owed him nothing. As the seasons changed and the cool breeze of autumn returned, Jack knew one thing for certain: bringing Shadow into their lives hadn't just saved her. It had changed them forever.